They said slavery was about obedience, about work, about building a nation from the sweat of the enslaved. But that was only the story they told in daylight. When night came, when candles burned low and doors were locked, another story began, a story so filthy, so unspeakable, that even history tried to bury it. The sound of boots on wooden floors, the whisper of keys turning, and the faint tremor of fear that lived in every breath of those who knew what came next. This was the other side of slavery, the hidden rooms, the secret rituals of power, and the disturbing games played by those who owned both bodies and souls. Behind the grand white walls of the plantation house, where portraits of wealthy men stared down from polished frames, the true face of domination lived in silence. These weren't just homes. They were theaters of cruelty, each room a stage for control, humiliation, and desire twisted into something monstrous. The world was told that slavery was about economics, about cotton and tobacco and trade. But what really thrived here was the corruption of power, a sickness that seeped into every corner of those so-called civilized estates. The plantation was a kingdom. The master was its god. Every life within its borders bent to his will. And while the world outside saw elegance and grace, inside these walls, there were rules written in fear. The enslaved could not refuse, could not speak, could not even look too long at the wrong person without risk. Even their silence was owned. Every heartbeat was permission, every breath a debt. The master's word was law, and the law itself was designed to protect him. No act he committed could be judged. No cruelty could be named. In this twisted empire, humanity was negotiable and morality, a luxury only the powerful could afford. It wasn't just about forcing bodies to work the fields. It was about owning their very existence. The plantation wasn't a workplace, it was a world of secrets. There were rooms where no enslaved person dared to go, chambers where the air itself seemed poisoned by the memories of what happened there. Some called them the master's quarters, others whispered the forbidden rooms. To the enslaved, those spaces were nightmares made of reality, because once you were summoned there, you never returned the same. And yet, upstairs, the laughter continued, the parties carried on, the guests toasted to wealth and civility, all while, behind closed doors, the true cost of that comfort was being paid in screams no one wanted to hear. White mistresses often pretended not to notice. They looked away from the bruises, from the missing faces. They polished their pearls and prayed in the morning, while the cries of the night faded into whispers. The hypocrisy was suffocating piety by day, perversion by night. The same hands that opened the Bible to preach obedience were the hands that silenced their victims. These were not men of faith, they were men of appetite, obsessed with domination, addicted to control, feeding on the power that came from having no limits. For the enslaved, resistance was almost impossible. The system was built to make them powerless, to make even their suffering invisible. They were told that their pain was part of God's will, that their submission was divine order. The law called them property. Religion called them servants, and history, for a long time, called them silent. But they were not silent, they were silenced. The hidden crimes inside those rooms weren't accidents of circumstance. They were deliberate acts performed under the shield of ownership. White men claimed purity in public but used their status to defile in private. Enslaved women were trapped in an unending nightmare, chosen, taken, discarded. They bore children who carried both their blood and their shame, forced to raise the reminders of their own violation, and still, they worked the fields at dawn, eyes hollow, hands trembling, pretending not to feel what could never be spoken. And it wasn't only women. Enslaved men were beaten, broken, emasculated, made to kneel before their oppressors. Some were forced to watch the abuse of those they loved, their bodies used to teach submission, their pain turned into a performance of obedience. This was psychological warfare, a systematic destruction of dignity. Every act of cruelty was a message: you are nothing. Yet, even in the darkest silence, something survived. Whispers passed between the enslaved stories of the master's sickness, of the nights when footsteps echoed through the halls. They spoke in code, in songs, in prayers. They warned each other not to be alone, not to be chosen. Their faith became rebellion, their survival a form of resistance. Because to endure, in a world designed to erase you, was the most powerful defiance of all. But these rooms, these filthy rooms, held more than bodies, they held memories. The walls themselves seemed to breathe with the past. Every mark, every stain, every locked door was a confession written in silence. The masters may have died, their names carved into marble, their legacies polished by history, but the ghosts of their crimes never left. They remain, haunting the ruins of those plantations, whispering the stories the world still struggles to hear. Even when freedom came, the echoes of those secret rooms didn't fade, they lingered, hidden in bloodlines, in family stories told behind closed doors. Because what happened inside those walls didn't just vanish with the passing of time. It lived on, generation after generation, a haunting inheritance of pain wrapped in silence. When historians talk about slavery, they often speak of economics, rebellion, and emancipation. But they rarely speak of the nights of forced intimacy, the unrecorded horrors that turned human beings into possessions of flesh. To write about it meant confronting the nation's dirtiest truth, that the foundations of American power were soaked not just in labor, but in lust, greed, and moral rot. Many of the enslaved tried to speak after the war, their words trembling as they described the house calls, the special favors, the punishments that weren't for work. They spoke of white mistresses who knew but said nothing, of masters who treated human suffering like entertainment. But even their testimonies were often dismissed, called exaggerations, rumors, or unfit for public record. Because to acknowledge those crimes meant shattering the myth of the noble South, the myth of the civilized master. It meant facing that America's greatness had been built not only on chains, but on the violation of its own soul. In one recorded account, an elderly woman named Fanny said, "When I was called to the big house, I prayed I'd come back alive." Her words carry centuries of pain that history tried to sanitize. There were hundreds like her, whose bodies became battlegrounds between domination and survival. For them, each sunrise was a victory, each breath an act of rebellion. And then there were the men, strong, proud, stripped of dignity by masters who couldn't bear to see power in black skin. Some were forced to watch their wives taken, their daughters humiliated, their families torn apart. They were broken not just in body, but in spirit. The system wanted them to forget what manhood meant, to erase the idea that strength could exist outside whiteness. That was the dirtiest secret of all. Slavery was never just about control. It was about destroying every possible mirror in which black humanity could reflect itself. The white mistresses were not innocent observers. Many of them became silent accomplices, jealous enforcers of the same cruelty that trapped them in their gilded cages. Some directed their anger not at their husbands, but at the enslaved women who bore the evidence of those filthy liaisons. Envy turned to violence. There are stories of women punished for looking too long, beaten for being too favored. The plantation was a theater of hypocrisy, where morality was paraded for guests while sin was served in secret. At church on Sunday, these same masters and mistresses sang hymns about grace and redemption. They bowed their heads before God, whispering prayers of purity. But every amen echoed off the walls of crimes that could never be washed clean. The cross that hung in their parlors was not salvation, it was decoration. They preached about light while living in darkness, and America believed them. The nation built monuments to these families, calling them founders, pioneers, patriots. But behind their portraits were hidden victims, unnamed, uncounted, unacknowledged. Black history remembers what white history refused to write. It remembers the trembling hands, the whispers, the footsteps in the hallway, the sound of a latch turning in the dark, and then came silence, the long silence after freedom. The descendants of the enslaved carried these wounds quietly, afraid to speak of them even to their own children. How do you tell a story so disturbing that even your tongue feels stained by it? How do you name a pain that has no justice, no apology, no grave? So they buried it in their hearts, where memory became a kind of survival. But the truth never dies, it waits. And in time, it began to surface again. In the 20th century, researchers and historians started uncovering letters, diaries, records written by the oppressors themselves. Their words betrayed them, lines about favored servants, about the comforts of company, about my household property. The very people who tried to hide their crimes left traces of them, written in the arrogance of power. Today, DNA studies reveal what they denied for centuries: bloodlines that cross color, ancestry that connects the enslaved and the enslaver. The proof lives in faces, in genes, in families who share a history neither side asked for. The descendants of victims and perpetrators often walk the same streets, unaware that their blood once flowed through the same house, the same bed, the same night of horror. History has a way of revealing its ghosts in the most ordinary places. And yet, even now, the conversation remains uncomfortable. Schools teach about slavery's labor, its economics, its abolition, but rarely about the secret rooms, the unspeakable crimes that turned human intimacy into an instrument of power. Some call it shameful to discuss, but what's truly shameful is pretending it never happened. To ignore these truths is to betray the memory of those who suffered in silence, because their pain is not history, it's inheritance. It's the reason certain wounds still ache today, why trust and trauma run deep in Black families, why echoes of fear still linger in the collective memory. The past never disappears, it hides beneath the floorboards, waiting for someone brave enough to lift them. Those rooms may be empty now, their doors warped and rotting with time. But listen closely and you can still hear them breathe. Every creak, every gust of wind through the broken shutters carries the voices of those who once prayed for mercy inside. They whisper of power abused, of dignity stolen, of love turned into punishment. They remind us that no civilization built on pain can ever call itself pure. The truth is disturbing, yes, but it must disturb. Because comfort never brings justice, and history that doesn't hurt cannot heal. These were not just crimes of flesh, they were crimes of the soul, of conscience, of humanity itself. And until we face them, until we say their names and tell their stories out loud, the walls of those rooms will keep whispering, forever asking the question that still haunts America. What happens to a nation that builds its greatness on someone else's pain?